44% of American teenagers reported persistent feelings of hopelessness last year. Not some teenagers, nearly half. That number, drawn from a CDC study of over 7,700 high school students, is what finally forced the US Surgeon General to act. In 2023, Dr. Vivek Murthy issued an official advisory warning about a generation's mental health, the first of its kind in over 50 years. Not a disease outbreak, not a war, a generation. Emergency room visits for teen self-harm had surged 188% over the prior decade. 188%. And that number keeps climbing. By the end of this video, you'll understand the exact psychological forces driving that crisis, and why the most cited research may be measuring the entire story wrong. Because there's a finding buried in the data that almost nobody covered. It changes everything. And later, I'll show you what Harvard kept finding, 50 years apart, that the entire research community somehow keeps being surprised by. The year is 2012, and almost nothing newsworthy happens. At least on the surface. No major recession, no pandemic, no obvious catastrophe to explain what comes next. But San Diego State University psychologist Dr. Jean Twenge, who had spent 25 years tracking generational mental health data, noticed something alarming in that year's numbers. Teen depression rates, essentially flat for decades, suddenly spiked upward. Sharply, loneliness scores jumped, in-person social activity dropped, all within a single 12-month window. She cross-referenced the data. One variable correlated almost perfectly with the shift. Smartphone adoption among American teenagers had crossed 50% in 2012. That's it. That's the inflection point. Now, I want to plant two things in your mind right now. First, later in this video, we're going to get to a finding from Oxford that analyzed 400,000 adolescents and concluded that screens are, quote, about as significant as eating potatoes. I am not making that up. Second, we're going to reach a measurement problem hiding inside all this data, something that has nothing to do with screens, social media, or parenting. That may mean the entire cross-generational comparison is measuring the wrong variable entirely. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Gen Z, defined by the Pew Research Center as Americans born between 1997 and 2012, is the first generation to grow up entirely inside the smartphone era, and the scale of what's happening to them is staggering. That CDC study of over 7,700 high school students found 44% reported persistent sadness or hopelessness over the previous year. Nearly half of American teenagers. Among girls specifically, 57%. Sit with that, more than half of American teenage girls reported persistent hopelessness. That's not a data blip, that's a defining feature of a generation's experience. Then the Harvard numbers. A study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry found anxiety disorders among Americans aged 18 to 25 had increased by 63% between 2008 and 2018. 63% in 10 years. And here's the statistic that stopped researchers cold. According to the American Psychological Association, Gen Z is the only generation reporting worse mental health outcomes than every prior generation. Every single one. Millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, the silent generation. All of them. But here's what nobody talks about. These numbers don't just reflect sadness. They reflect a fundamental shift in how an entire generation processes and reports its own reality. The distinction between feeling bad and talking about feeling bad is going to matter enormously before this video is over. Most conversations about Gen Z mental health blame social media, full stop, and the research does support a connection. A landmark study from the University of Pennsylvania, published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology in 2018, found that limiting social media use to 30 minutes per day produced significant reductions in loneliness and depression among college students. In just 3 weeks. 3 weeks. That sounds like a clean verdict, right? Screens bad. Put them down. Problem solved. But here's where it gets genuinely complicated. In 2022, Oxford University psychologist Andrew Przybylski conducted what may be the most comprehensive screen time study ever assembled. a meta-analysis drawing on data from 400,000 adolescents across multiple countries. His conclusion, the statistical relationship between screen time and well-being, was, and I want you to hear this carefully, quote, about as significant as wearing glasses or eating potatoes. Small, probably not causal. Potatoes. So if 400,000 data points say screens are basically irrelevant, and a Penn study says 30 minutes of limits reduces depression in 3 weeks, who's right? Here's what almost nobody is saying. The answer depends entirely on something the headline studies almost never measure separately. And once you understand the distinction, both findings make complete sense. They were never actually contradicting each other. In 2023, Stanford psychologist Gregory Walton published research that added an entirely different dimension to this story. His team found that one of the strongest predictors of Gen Z mental health outcomes wasn't screen time, wasn't social comparison, and wasn't parenting style. It was something called belonging uncertainty, the persistent low-grade feeling that you might not truly belong anywhere. Walton's research followed 2,400 American college freshmen across 4 years. Students who reported high belonging uncertainty were 3.4 times more likely to develop clinical anxiety and 2.8 times more likely to drop out of college entirely. Here's the thing, belonging isn't a new idea. Abraham Maslow placed it directly in the center of his hierarchy of needs back in 1943. It sits above survival, above safety. Human beings require it like they require food. But Walton's research revealed something Maslow couldn't have anticipated. The digital environment has created a paradox so precise, it almost sounds engineered. Gen Z is more connected than any generation in recorded history. The average American teenager sends over 3,000 texts per month, and they report the highest levels of belonging uncertainty ever measured. Surrounded by connection, feeling profoundly, deeply alone. That paradox, the most connected generation feeling the most isolated, is one of the defining psychological phenomena of this century, and it leads directly to the finding I teased at the beginning, the measurement problem hiding in plain sight, the one that reframes every statistic we've looked at. Remember that open loop from the beginning, the measurement problem that has nothing to do with screens, social media, or parenting. Here it is. Columbia University psychologist George Bonanno has spent 30 years studying resilience across populations. His lab has followed survivors of 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, and the COVID pandemic. And in 2022, he published findings that reframed the entire conversation about Gen Z. His research showed that this generation, despite its documented mental health crisis, demonstrates something he calls elevated psychological flexibility. They are measurably better at tolerating ambiguity, holding multiple emotional states simultaneously, and recovering from acute stress events than any prior generation he had studied. But here's the measurement problem, and this is the part that changes everything. Gen Z's spike in diagnosed mental health conditions isn't purely a sign of greater fragility. It's significantly a sign of greater awareness, and a dramatically higher willingness to name what they're experiencing and seek professional help. In 1990, roughly 1 in 5 Americans with a diagnosable mental health condition ever sought treatment. By 2022, among Gen Z specifically, that ratio had shifted to nearly 1 in 3 actively seeking care. The APA calls this the awareness paradox. More diagnoses don't always mean more illness. Sometimes, maybe often, they mean more honesty. Think about what that means for every statistic we've looked at in this video, every graph, every percentage. If prior generations were suffering in silence and Gen Z is speaking up, then the comparison across generations isn't measuring suffering at all. It's measuring disclosure. Prior generations didn't suffer less. They just pretended better. And frankly, that reframing is more significant than anything else we've covered, because it means the crisis, while real, may be partly a crisis of visibility, a generation finally refusing to pretend. In 2023, Dr. Robert Waldinger, director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, the longest continuously running study of human happiness in recorded history, now in its 86th year, released a finding that stopped the research community. His team had been tracking what predicts mental well-being in Gen Z specifically. And the single strongest predictor wasn't therapy access, wasn't social media reduction, wasn't medication, school policy, or smartphone restrictions. It was the quality of in-person relationships with at least one non-parental adult. One adult who wasn't their parent, a coach, a mentor, a teacher, a neighbor, a pastor, a boss at a part-time job. Waldinger's team found that Gen Z teenagers who reported having that one relationship were 42% less likely to develop clinical anxiety and 38% less likely to report persistent hopelessness. 42%. From one relationship, not a drug, not a program, not an app, one human being who showed up. And here's what stopped me when I read this. That finding isn't new. Back in 1973, Harvard developmental psychologist Urie Bronfenbrenner, one of the architects of Head Start, the federal program that has served over 37 million American children, wrote that every child needs at least one adult who is irrationally, unconditionally enthusiastic about them. Irrational, unconditional, a 1973 researcher, a 2023 dataset. The same answer. Harvard ran the study for 86 years, and it kept finding the same thing. It just kept finding it. Here's the synthesis. Gen Z is not a broken generation. They are a generation that was handed a neurologically unprecedented environment, infinite social comparison, belonging uncertainty at massive scale, a mental health infrastructure that was already underfunded before the crisis began. Right at the most sensitive developmental window in the entire human lifespan. The research from Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, NYU, and the NIH doesn't tell a simple story of screens making kids sad. It tells a more complicated, more honest story. Passive digital consumption at scale, during a hypersensitive developmental window, in a society running 17,000 specialists short of what it needs, created conditions for a genuine crisis. In a generation that has, remarkably, responded by being more willing to name what they're carrying than any prior generation in American history. Jonathan Haidt, whose book The Anxious Generation reached the New York Times bestseller list in 2024, has called for 4 structural changes. No smartphones before high school, no social media before age 16, phone-free schools, and far greater investment in unsupervised in-person time and community. Not because screens are the whole story. They're not, as Oxford's 400,000-person analysis showed, but because the human brain requires certain developmental experiences that no algorithm, no platform, and no notification can replicate. And those experiences are being crowded out in the specific window when the brain needs them most. The window that closes only once. Phase 1. Synthesis. We opened this video with a number, 44% of American teenagers reporting persistent hopelessness. And now you understand the full architecture of what produced it. Not a single cause, not a simple villain. A convergence, passive consumption at population scale, social comparison across millions instead of 150, belonging uncertainty in a paradoxically hyper-connected world, and a mental health system running 17,000 specialists short of what it needs, all arriving simultaneously at the most neurologically sensitive period in a human life. And the awareness paradox at the center of it all, the generation that looks most broken on paper, may, in part, simply be the first generation honest enough to tell the truth about what they're carrying. Prior generations didn't suffer less. They just pretended better. Phase 2. Final statement. The most sophisticated psychological research of the 21st century keeps arriving at the same answer that a Harvard researcher wrote down in 1973. That humans heal through humans, not through algorithms, not through advisories, not through apps, through presence, one adult, one real relationship. Irrational, unconditional enthusiasm for another person. Bronfenbrenner wrote it in 1973. Waldinger proved it again in 2023. Harvard ran the study for 86 years. The answer never changed. It just kept waiting for us to listen. Phase 3. Closing. If there's one person in your life who might be that adult for a young person, a student, a neighbor, a nephew, a kid on your block, consider this your reminder. The research has been saying the same thing for 50 years. If you found this valuable, follow the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.